So the way that we thought we would conduct this session is I would first give you an overall snapshot of the Folklore of Finance research. And this research itself didn't specifically look at gender, but then what we're going to do is roll into a fireside chat where John's going to interview me to talk about what are the implications of this research as it relates to gender and gender diversity. I'm going to say something just to warn you, I'm going to start off on a fairly pessimistic note, but I promise we will end with some optimism. Especially over lunch, we need some of that. What if I told you that the way the investment management industry has been managed and has actually thrived for decades will lead to its eventual downfall? And what if we didn't realize this until it was too late? Now, by all measures, since the financial crisis, global assets under management, net revenues, and profit margins have all consistently risen. The industry continues to rank among the most profitable in the world. But we ask the question, is the industry successful? And we would argue no. Just because the industry is profitable does not mean the industry is successful. And we found that the models for success in the investment management industry are broken. And the fracture that lies beneath that surface is real. Now, despite the best intentions of investment professionals, financial advisors, and many others operating within and across the industry, perhaps because of these best intentions, investment professionals are failing to deliver alpha, and investors are failing to achieve their long-term goals. And there's something meaningful that underlies this current state, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Over the course of the last 18 months, we've collected the views of 3,700 participants across 19 countries and collected empirical data to answer that one seemingly simple question: what does true success look like? And we found, and actually let me ask each of you, we conducted about 200 face-to-face interviews with wealth managers, investment managers, institutional investors all over the world. And the first question we asked is, how do you define success? And how do you think, what were some common responses for how organizations primarily define success?
Beating the market, client retention.
Yes. Growing. Assets under management. Yep. Profits. Yep. And then the only one to round out the equation there is alpha. And so, as you can see, it was very few, less than 11% of the time, in fact, did people share with us that their view of success and measurement of success is to help our clients achieve their goals. Herein lies the problem. And so let's take the alpha piece first. So the industry, we need to move well beyond what the industry has previously accepted as true success. Not only do we need to produce sustainable alpha as an industry, but we also, even more important than that, need to help deliver results that are consistent with the long-term goals of our clients that we're here to serve. Now, on the alpha piece, I know many of you are probably not fixated on alpha in the way that some other audiences I've presented to are. So we'll treat this, a little bit lighter weight, and then we'll focus on the client side. On the alpha piece, we all know how challenging, any organization, each of you looking to produce alpha, raise your hands, yes. Okay, half, maybe 2/3. Okay. And most in the industry are. 60% of this industry's capital expenditure is devoted to one thing, the production of alpha. So that reflects this audience here. So on the alpha side, we all know how very difficult it is, and it is becoming that much more difficult to generate alpha in this environment due to central bank involvement and many other factors that are at work. So we're not going to talk about that. That's old news. We all know that. What I do want to talk about is, as we have spent a lot of time with the end clients, whether they be individual investors or be they institutional investors, we found that there is a great degree of skepticism. In fact, in a lot of these discussions, we could not stop talking about the lack of alpha being produced and how much fees they're paying to get what in return. Not much. So some data behind this, we found that individual investors themselves are quite skeptical about alpha and outperformance. Speak up. Yes. Okay. I can have a very loud voice so that the wait staff will not impede with my, now sorry, I'm going to end up shouting at you all here in front of me. So individual investors, only 53% of individual investors believe that alpha is primarily based on skill versus luck. Now, take that stat with a grain of salt because retail investors have no idea what alpha is, so we had to explain the heck out of the definition to get them to answer the question. So surely investment professionals themselves must be far more optimistic about their own abilities to produce alpha. And unfortunately, even fewer investment professionals believe that their own alpha is produced primarily based on skill versus luck. We have a problem. When the industry spends 60% of its total capital on the pursuit of alpha, and investment professionals themselves believe it is primarily based on luck versus skill. But we have an even bigger problem. We are here to serve our clients. And so let's talk about the client side. Only 12% of individual investors globally believe that they're on track to achieve their long-term goal, which is to comfortably retire. 12%. So clearly investors need far more help than portfolio management and security selection alone. Investors need help understanding what true success looks like for them. Now for some of you that might be thinking, well, I've heard all this before. I've heard alpha is hard to generate. I've heard clients are not achieving their goals. Why is this a problem for me now? I will tell you why this is a problem for you now. Let me introduce you to what we're affectionately calling the 3 Ds. Distrust leads to dissatisfaction, which ultimately leads to disintermediation. Distrust. You all have heard CFA has produced research in conjunction with Edelman on this front. We have as well. Only half of the investors, be they institutional or be they individual, believe that their investment provider is acting in the best interest of the client. And here's the kicker. Investment professionals believe that that is a true statement. That more often than not, we are under tremendous pressure to be acting in our own best interest, even in some cases at the expense of doing what's right for the client. Distrust leads to dissatisfaction. 2/3 of investors express no particular loyalty to their primary investment provider. This leads to disintermediation, which is the most damaging D of all. Investors are taking matters into their own hands.
What percentage of people say that they're dissatisfied or disgusted?
So 50% distrust.
50%.
That's true across, interesting, very even numbers where institutional, say, the pension funds, sovereign wealth, central banks, and then about 50% of the individual investors as well across all wealth levels. Slightly higher trust levels, if you imagine, for the high net worth, ultra high net worth family office segment, but still not what we would like to be seeing here.
Did they ask the question directly for your advisor, or did they ask the question in general about the financial industry?
They asked the question, we asked it both ways, and they do not trust the organization, let's put it that way. And there's higher levels of trust for the advisor, but still not as much as we would have liked to have seen. So we did see that divide where they trust the advisor more than their organization, but the trust levels were still slightly higher, 60%, but not that much more. We would hope for better.
Break down by channels like independent advisor.
Independent RIAs are among the most trusted in the world. So much higher, significantly higher levels for the RIAs being most trustworthy, and down at the bottom of the list are some of the wirehouse broker-dealers. Now, part of that is attributed to the organizations and the media and all of that gets caught into the psychology of how individual investors perceive, their own trust of the institution they're working with and also the financial advisor. Disintermediation. Investors are beginning to take matters into their own hands. And this is a pretty frightening set of statistics I'm about to share. 93% of individual investors of all walks of life, even high net worth and ultra high net worth, believe that it's best that they make their own investment decisions without an advisor. Surprising statistic. 2/3 of individual investors believe that their best investment to date was entirely their own decision. What do you think their best, I'll put the term investment in quotes, what do you think the best investment was?
Their house.
Yes, their house. Land, property, and cash, 40% allocated to cash is what we're talking about here in terms of the individual investor. Wouldn't call any of that the best investment.
One thing I've seen these statistics, and the part that we've told people as an industry, you need to hold 6 months in cash. Right?
Yeah.
And then we've also realized that 50 or 60% of the entire population is not invested in stocks at all. So when you give that statistic, it's a little bit misleading to look at the whole group, right, as one, when in reality, investing and investment decisions should really be focused on the 40 who are investing, not on the measure of the whole 100, right?
Even when we break it out by, so we've got 3 segments. There's the mass market, which would be, under 100K, and then there's mass affluent, and then the high net worth is 1 million and up. And what's most interesting is even in the upper ends of the spectrum, regardless of wealth level, there's a very high, significantly higher than a typical allocation to cash right now and since the financial crisis. So on average, pre-financial crisis, the investors globally were around 1/4 allocated to cash. And that number has skyrocketed to 40%. And part of that is that they don't trust the markets with their money. So what we're doing, we're sending the right message that you have to have enough cash, and it depends on how much wealth they have at the end of the day, which is to your point. But what we need to think about is that, in part, that's a very nuanced message, because yes, you want cash, but it's not because that causes a lot of fear of the markets when we're going out, very publicly with the message you have to have enough cash because the markets are scary. They already know that. They're already completely freaked out. So we need to treat that very carefully. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's a very, as you probably know, not sure what your role. What's your role? From your own experience? Derivatives. Okay. You probably know from your own experience talking clients off the ledge.
Yep.
Especially with derivatives.
I put them on the ledge.
Derivatives can actually be quite helpful with tail risk management. So there's a really good story there too, depending upon your line of work. So long way of saying that investors trust themselves, they don't trust the markets, and they're not trusting organizations or their investment providers. So just because the industry is profitable does not mean the industry is successful. The most important question is why? Why are the models for success in our industry fundamentally broken? And the title of our paper that John mentioned is The Folklore of Finance. Folklore is the why. And folklore is the collective literature, knowledge, art, and practice that is disseminated through behavioral example and oral communication. That's a mouthful. I've said that one a few times. Summed up simply, folklore are the stories we tell ourselves and others as we make decisions. And in the way of folklore, one of the most profound types of folklore is the urban legend. I'm sure many of you can think of urban legends. In this country, in America, one of the most famous ones in our lifetime, if not the most famous one and the most powerful one, is the Halloween candy razor blade story. Any of you remember this? Some giggles here. And I remember trick-or-treating this year with my sister, and we went around, as us crazy Americans like to do, knocking on doors, collecting candy from the neighbors. And I remember vividly being called down to the police station where all of the policemen and women inspected our candy to make sure there were no razor blades in the candy. And this took hours. By the time we got home, we were thoroughly exhausted and quite frankly pretty freaked out by the whole experience. So the last thing we wanted to do was to enjoy Halloween that year. Now, what's most interesting and what may not be known by at least everyone in this room is that it never actually happened. There were never razor blades placed in anyone's candy. And it took off. That is the power of folklore. And it changes behaviors. It changed the behavior of an entire nation as it relates to one of the most fun holidays for our children. So the question is, how does folklore manifest itself in the investment management industry? And folklore manifests itself in many ways. Some are conscious, and others are unconscious. Now, the conscious folklore is what we're calling the folklore of false comfort. This is the human tendency to gravitate towards things that are easily quantified, easily measured, and ultimately easily justified as we make our decisions. And we asked a very interesting question, and we were quite surprised with the results that we got back. We asked institutions as well as individuals, how do you primarily measure your own success? Any guesses as to how these results come out? And I'll give you a hint, it's not to achieve their organizations or their own long-term goals. Sad, but true. Beat your benchmark. So specifically, outperforming a largely irrelevant benchmark in a largely irrelevant time frame. Number 2, outperforming a largely irrelevant peer group in a largely irrelevant time frame. Only 22% of institutional investors measure their own success as achieving their organization's long-term goal. I told you it's going to get more depressing. We're going to get better. Individual investors, same story. Only 29% of them measure their own success as achieving their long-term goals. How do they measure success? Outperforming the, you name it, S&P 500, the Dow Jones, whatever benchmark. That's why we're always having to have conversations to say, it's okay, stop watching the markets, that is not your measure of success, and reset the balance to get them to focus on the goal, because it's hard. We have this staring at us in the faces every day, right? We live and breathe the markets, it's everywhere. So very hard to redirect their energy and have them focus on the right measurement of success, which of course is the goal. So folklore of false comfort. It's natural to focus on things that are concrete. That's where this comes from. We're human. We like things that are concrete, like benchmarks, like peer groups. We can outperform them and it's concrete, we can measure them. We avoid at all costs the pain associated with understanding and doing something about something abstract, especially if it's long-term in the future, like a goal, right? So this all makes sense, but gives us a false comfort because we have something concrete. We end up making many destructive decisions as a result. So that's the folklore of false comfort. Now, this is at the conscious level. Most of us and clients are aware that we do these things, and we try to correct and put in places to address that. Now, the much more destructive form of folklore is the folklore of knowledge. This is we think we know, but we don't. And in one of the most fun / exciting experiences in my career, we interviewed about 130 portfolio managers face-to-face all over the world. And we found something pretty interesting. They consistently attributed themselves for success, and then they consistently blamed others for failure.
Oh, that's a surprise.
We're going to talk about the gender. We're going to talk about gender in a minute, but just think through all these folklores. Just think gender differences. We're going to get to that. So this is how this played out. First question we asked: tell us about a time where you were successful as it relates to making an investment decision, and why were you successful? Well, it's because of my experience, my analytical abilities, my ability to strip out my emotions from my investment decisions. All factors that are internal to them. And the very next question, tell us about a time when you were not so successful. And why were you not so successful? What do you think the number one answer was?
It was because
something else. Yep. Something. And what is this on markets? Yes. Markets took a turn for the worse. 99% of the time. Bad luck. I love that one. That's like anything but not. And then for those of you that might be quantitative managers, you are not immune to behavioral bias. This is called self-attribution bias. And we found the quant managers, this is a fun one, that they would say things like, well, the model that I inherited is fundamentally broken and the assumptions are all flawed. I didn't build this model. That was someone else who predates me. So folklore of knowledge. And then what happens, they go on to tell me a very compelling story. The power of the narrative with such conviction, they thoroughly convince themselves that this is the truth. Mind you, none of this is grounded in any sort of reality. So the question is, as an industry, how are we learning from our successes and our failures when we're not seeing the truth? Individual investors, they too suffer from the folklore of knowledge. They think they know, but they don't. And given the overconfidence and how they think that they make the best investment decisions without any help of anyone, they want control. We administered a financial literacy, well, first, let me back up. The last research study we did, we asked investors to rate their level of investment acumen. This is self-reported data. So to what extent do you believe that you have a level of financial literacy? 2/3 rated their level of financial literacy as advanced, not just good, advanced. And so for this study, we decided to test them, and we constructed a full-blown financial literacy test, administered the test across 16 countries, and found, as you would imagine, in no way is this population anywhere near being financially literate. We scored 61% is the average literacy score, barely D-. US ranks 10th out of 16 countries. We need to do better than that. They think they know, but they don't. This is the folklore of knowledge, and it has widespread implications for the future of our industry. So what we end up with is folklore's vicious cycle. We have folklore, which drives our behavior, which drive the activities of the industry, and then we create more folklore. So the question is, where do we go from here? And this is where, time for some optimism. We are actually very excited about the future of the investment management industry. And what we need to do is we need to create a new set of beliefs and behaviors. We need to create a new folklore to replace our existing folklore in order to drive meaningful change. What does that look like? Well, I mentioned earlier, there are two dimensions of true success for our industry. The first is alpha production, but that pales in comparison to the first and foremost, which is adding value to our clients, delivering results that are consistent with their long-term goals. And what we've done as an industry is we're operating in what we're affectionately calling the Titanic, the lower left quadrant, where we are spending the majority of our time, money, and energy on unproductive activities. And I'll give you two, but you can think of a lot more. An over-reliance on past performance as an indication of future expected returns, when we all know, and this is in every single disclaimer, that past performance is no indication of future expected returns. Yet that's how we make the vast majority of our decisions as an industry and as our clientele. Over-reliance on external sources, such as Morningstar, where everyone has stars in their eyes in the hopes that they can make effective investment decisions. And then an over-reliance on institutional pension consultants to say, I'm just going to outsource that accountability and the decision-making and call it a day. Now, we need to be operating in the upper right quadrant, which we're affectionately calling James Bond, and these are productive activities. And I'm just going to give you one example, but I think it tells the story. There's a whole bunch of activities grounded in behavior, right, as opposed to strictly the comfort and false comfort of things that are quantifiable. So this activity we're calling pain tolerance. We need to have a much higher threshold for pain. And in an anecdote, my husband, as I mentioned to John, has his PhD in physics from Harvard. He's kind of a smart guy. And it was quite painful for him to get his PhD. What this looked like for him is he stood in a dark room with a black box and he bounced electrons off one another to understand how the electrons interacted. He did this all day, every day for 4.5 years. That's pain tolerance. So apply pain tolerance to our industry and you start to see some interesting things. On the alpha dimension, PhDs outperform non-PhDs, but not for the reasons you think. It had very little to do with the field of study. It had everything to do with the discipline, the rigor, the following through, and most importantly, the constant questioning and scrutiny of assumptions that had them outperform non-PhDs on a sustainable basis. Now, switching gears to the more important axis of success, which is delivering results consistent with the goals of the client, we need to have a lot more frequent and a lot more painful conversations with our clients because we have to reset their unrealistic expectations. This is a different time, and I know I'm preaching to the choir. We are operating in a low return environment, and they have a set of unrealistic expectations that times are going to go back to what they once were. So we need to sit down and have the hard conversations, both in terms of the institutional world, because their boards, firefighters by day, policemen by night, they don't understand that times are different now, and surely in the case of the individual investors. And it's painful for the provider to have the conversation, also painful for the client to be the recipient. And I'll give you one example, which is a little bit off the deep end example, but Bridgewater, where many of you know Ray Dalio's mega-sized hedge fund, and that culture is all about pain tolerance. So they take this concept to an extreme. For those of you familiar with them, every day is a day of reckoning. You have to come up with at least 5 things you did wrong that day and have everyone talk about what you could have done better. I couldn't withstand that type of culture. But as it relates to the client conversations, this is quite fascinating, where they sit down with their clients and they have a very painful conversation. And they say, I'm sorry, we have evidence that you are operating on a short-term time horizon, and we're going to have to part ways because we are operating on a very different, much longer-term time horizon. And so then then we've interviewed the clients, right? All these big pension funds. Say, how did that make you feel? What did you do? And they said, well, we wanted to work with them more than ever before because no one has told us that they didn't want our money. And so it hit the reset button and they changed their behavior. They went back to the board because Bridgewater brought all this ammunition about their short-term behavior so that they had that ammunition to bring to the board, and then they were much more able to stay the course. And then they've developed very strong, very loyal, committed relationships as a result. But that's painful, that's not easy. So that's an extreme example of what we're talking about here, but if we can employ just a few of these activities in our industry, we will go a long way towards achieving true success. And back to the beginning of this conversation, we will end up healing the fracture that lies beneath the surface in our industry. So I'm going to pause here, and then we'll talk about the fun part of the conversation, implications for gender diversity. Any questions before?
One of the things that is just like, I hope they don't make me like shred my charter when I say this, but it seems like the focus on risk as being volatility just seems like the wrong way to talk about risk. And that, I mean, a whole orientation about asset allocation and everything is all based around standard deviation of returns, and it seems like that shouldn't necessarily be
at the forefront of every conversation.
Yeah, it's just like there are so many more risks than just volatility, and yet it seems like we're laser focused as a business on that.
Yes, so we've produced an entire white paper series called Artifacts Exposed, and what you're talking about is one of the artifacts that we have to get rid of in our industry. It needs to be one input, but not the only input. And right now, as you said, and same with market cap weighted indices, dart throwing monkeys outperform market cap weighted indices. Market cap weighted indices form the entire basis of the infrastructure of our industry. That's another artifact that we went after. And it's not that looking at volatility or Sharpe ratio, right, is inherently incorrect. It's one of many inputs that needs to be assessed. But and in fact, I'm actually working, I don't know if Bobby Lamy would be upset with me saying this, but I'll tell him after, and then hopefully that's forgiveness, not permission. But Bobby Lamy, who runs curriculum, you might know Bobby, curriculum development at the CFA Institute in Charlottesville, and he and I have been talking about, let's not call overhaul, let's call evolve the CFA curriculum. Because what we would say is that there's a lot of risks that go unassessed as it relates to individuals' behavior. Think about the self-attribution bias and all of these loads of behavioral biases that we all suffer from. I would argue, as would Bobby, that is at least on par, if not a greater risk that we have, either in ourselves in making inappropriate decisions, inadequate investment decisions, or in those of our clients. So we need to overlay additional definitions around how do we even define risk going forward, and it has to move well beyond. So obviously I'm passionate about this. This is something that I've thought a lot about.
Recently we had Daniel Crosby speaking, and I just went to a thing with Carl Richards where he talked about the behavior gap. And I think that all of this goals-based return and then realizing that there are all these behavioral weaknesses is a great way to get to the discussion. But the one thing that I keep getting back to is which of the behaviors that we have creates more of the gap. And that's where I think the industry, if we're all analysts and we're all going to say, what do I attack first?
Yep.
And that's where I think as an industry, we have all this research and we say, well, it's this behavior, this behavior, this behavior.
It's the order of priority. What do we do when we wake up on Monday morning? Which one? Exactly. Which one? So what we've researched, and this is, we'll make the Folklore of Finance people available, but we've come up with a series of 17 tactics that answers the question that you have, which is, what do we do when we wake up on Monday morning? Where do we begin this? Because this is seismic transition types of activities that we need to take on. And so we've organized them in different time frames. Some are easier than others. So 1 week versus 1 quarter versus more than 1 year. 1 week, something that every organization can and should do right now, if you don't do this already, is implement a challenge mechanism. And this is simply in important discussions when you're trying to solve an important problem, either with yourselves or with your clients. to have someone in the room play the role of devil's advocate. And this is based on psychologist Solomon Ash's work. You two are laughing. So which one of you is a devil's advocate? You do it for each other. She's devil's advocate. Very important to have that. Even if you believe in what the other person in front of you is saying, say, I don't agree and here's why. Just saying that and not even having any sort of semblance after those words, it doesn't matter. It resets the balance to say, how can I evaluate this problem like a prism from all different sides? And not just going with our incoming hypothesis, because we're very strong-willed as an industry, a lot of conviction. And oftentimes we lose some of the most important pieces of information as a result of that. So that's an example, challenge mechanism. That's something very simple to implement, could take a week to do that. At State Street might take longer than a week because we're huge. On the other end, revise incentive structures. This takes more than 1 year. This motivation paper, we wrote an entire 18-month research study on how do we address once and for all the incentive system within our industry. So more on that when we talk on this panel.
When you were answering Kathy's question, you mentioned getting away from cap-weighted indexes as an industry. Mm-hmm. But as an industry, you can only be cap-weighted. It's impossible for the entire industry to be non-cap-weighted.
Right.
That's the only investable thing.
Right.
And so I don't know who's taking the other side of those trades. If you're going to be non-cap-weighted, who's on the other side?
Okay, so let's talk about this right. So yes, the cap, because everything aggregates up into a cap-weighted scenario, because that's how we measure success of Now, I would question, we potentially should not have all the quarterly earnings and all of the madness that goes on to get to the market cap assessment in terms of the valuation process, but that's a separate point. It is what it is. We have to have that, but the orientation needs to evolve so that we're not measuring our success against an irrelevant, which many of them are, cap-weighted index, where we need to create a level of take off the shackles, right? Because we find so much benchmark hugging. And even though the manager may know the right thing to do, they're afraid of being wrong and alone and all of this that happens. So then no one's wrong and alone. And we've lost our DNA as an industry as a result of being beholden to these relative against the market cap weighted indice return. Like that's the piece to solve. It needs to be on an absolute basis, making the absolute number paramount, not the relative number paramount. But that's a good point. I mean, they're here to stay.
But everybody can't have an absolute number paramount and have the industry as a whole has negative alpha because of costs. It's
right.
Impossible for the entire industry to add value. It
right.
can't happen.
Right, because it's a zero-sum game.
Right.
Yes. Any other questions before? Okay, let's get to the fun part.
So I've brought along some questions that actually came not just from our society, but also from other societies that Suzanne has spoken with. And so I guess I would like to go ahead and hit the gender angle first and ask, in terms of folklore, would you say that men and women have a distinct folklore?
So think back to what I described around this folklore of false comfort and the folklore of knowledge. Those are the two folklores that we talked about. There are many other examples, but just to pick on those two. The folklore of false comfort, we find that women compared to men operate very differently on that folklore of false comfort dimension. Men, on average, tend to have a narrow focus on outperforming a benchmark. So there's two important words there, narrow and outperforming. And here's the third dimension, in a short-term time horizon. Now, making generalizations here, you men in the room are probably the exception to the norm, but this is on average, right? So there's a narrow thinking about this, outperformance and short-term. Now, women, on the other hand, other end of the spectrum, women tend to focus not on outperforming a benchmark on a short-term basis, but on average, tend to focus on a long-term goal, right? I'm sure many of you who have individual investors that are your clients, male versus female, you can probably see some of the differences there. So men, shorter-term benchmark outperformance, women, on average, long-term goal orientation. So women feel much more comfortable in living with abstraction, which is long-term goals. Those are abstract, way off typically into the future. There's no numbers behind it, apart from maybe a dollar sign that you're looking to accumulate. It's soft, like, what do I want my retirement to really look like? What am I here on earth for? Who do I want to provide for? What is my goal? This is all abstract, unquantifiable, intangible. The other end of the spectrum is the concrete, outperforming benchmark, concrete, narrow. Now, this, I was explaining earlier, this actually has some pretty interesting roots in biology and psychology, where it makes perfect sense. And it's not that either is right or wrong. Men were, biologically on Earth to hunt, right, and kill, and that took a cognitive functioning that is narrow, hunt, kill. Women had to provide for families, future generations. I mean, it was much more lateral as opposed to the narrow. And what I want to underscore is with the folklore of false comfort, if you bring men together with women in this scenario, given, and this is cognitive diversity, given their natural orientations, it's a beautiful thing. It's not that we have to replace all men with women, because we do have to have accountability in the short term, right? There's a lot of reasons. We do have to have things to measure and quantify. So that's where if you can bring together, but that was one of the starkest differences that we saw on the folklore of false comfort. The folklore of knowledge, we think we know, but we don't. This is far and away like the starkest difference, where the very few, there are only 7% of portfolio managers are women. Sad but true. And so when we did come across the interviews with the women portfolio managers, it was the opposite, where men, when they're successful, on average, they take credit for their success. And when they're unsuccessful, on average, they blame others, largely the markets, for failure. Women have the opposite problem, and it's not a good one either, where women, when we're successful, we give credit to someone else. And when we're unsuccessful, we blame ourselves. So it is the polar opposite reaction. And in neither scenario are we learning from actual success and actual failures, because we're too afraid on both sides, male, female, to see the truth in the decisions that we make. Now, if we can put both male and female together to make a decision, then we find that both in the case of folklore of false comfort and the folklore of knowledge, the storytelling that's not grounded in reality, it begins to subside. And that's, and I know we've got a question on sort of the benefits of diversity, but that story really tells it all. But I'm just curious to see, yeah.
I guess maybe before we go any further, we can help me establish something here. When is it okay to say women are like this and men are like that, and be real, and when is it just sexist?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't even know if
Depends on whether a man or woman's saying it.
Well, exactly. That's part of it too. Yeah.
I don't want to just be stereotypical, saying, okay,
Yeah.
this is the bucket you fall in, or so on. So with these types
Yeah,
of things.
it's a really tricky balance, and I'm glad you're raising this question, because you don't want to cross the line in being stereotypical, because what if the person becomes offended, right? And that's the last thing that you want. And ethically, you might feel, unethical about making the statement that you did, and then that doesn't end well. But what we've done, and what I've seen other successful individuals and organizations do, is if you lean on academic research, like lean on our research, lean on academic research to say, academic research shows. So then it's not you asserting your view, and then you do have to have some data, or at least the sentences to back it up. Research shows this. And then it neutralizes the conversation so that you can still have the conversation without saying, men are like this, women are like this, because then that is like your opinion as opposed to grounded in, some prominent research. Does that answer it?
Yeah, but what I'm more worried about is saying, like you were saying, maybe women tend to have a longer term view of the goal. Well, what if I'm talking to one who has a shorter term goal? I don't want to take these things for granted, so to speak.
Yes.
And you have to figure out, okay, well, is this the vast majority of the time? Is it just tends to be a plurality of the time?
This is where,
how prevalent are these tendencies?
Financial planning questionnaires don't cut the mustard when it comes to this sort of thing, and we have developed it's a diagnostic. It's a personality assessment, but geared more towards the world of, we haven't released it yet, but we will imminently. This is part of the motivation work. And what we were trying to do is to test individuals, whether they male or female, on their orientations. Everyone is more sensitive to whether it's a long-term goal, and that's what the focus is, or whether it's outperforming a benchmark. Is it long-term? Is it short-term? So we've created a battery of questions based on motivational theory. We didn't just make this was like grounded in 50 years worth of motivation theory and applied it to our industry for the first time ever, which is why we're pretty excited about this. But we've developed that type of diagnostic where at least you, first of all, test yourselves. That's the goal. And then figure out, because you have your own, everyone has their own innate inclinations, right? That's establish that baseline. And then, once you're comfortable, then you can assess, your clientele. And we do think that it's going to give you a sense for what the orientation is of the individual, male, female, because you're right, like in some cases a male could be operating more of female based on this academic research, and you won't know because they won't tell you unless you sort of self-assess. And it creates, we've done it before, and it creates actually really interesting conversations to talk about, it's a way to have the conversation about what their natural inclinations are.
I don't think the empirical data even helps because it's just things you're not allowed to say. I mean,
Yeah.
Larry Summers was empirically correct in his comments at Harvard, got him fired anyway.
Yeah.
And you'd think any place, Harvard, would be able to say things that were true, but apparently not.
Yeah. It is a real challenge, and I think it's less of a challenge for women than it is for men, right? Because the lens is on the male, just saying inappropriate things and stereotyping and generalizations and all of that. And when the gentleman asked the question, I'm like, that's a really hard one. I'm not going to pretend to have answers there, but it's good to have the conversation to say, how can we make this work? Because there's a lot of learning in there on both sides, but you don't want to get fired or offend someone for having the conversation to begin with. Oh, and what's interesting? This is a bit of a tangent, but one thing that this gets to your point earlier, like what can we do right now? On the gender front, what do you think? So 2/3 of the time, the woman fires the financial advisor after the man passes away. You might have heard these statistics. So 2/3 of the time, the financial advisor is fired after the husband dies. Why do you think that's the case?
Because the wife typically didn't have the relationship with the advisor.
Yes, that is the overall, but there's something very specific. I don't know if anyone. So we did this research in conjunction with State Street Global Advisors, and it's because the financial advisor did not make eye contact with the woman. That's an example of, like, what can we do right now? And it sounds obvious, but you're human. If the man is talking and doing all the talking, we're going to look at the man and interact with the man. If the woman is, because women may not feel as comfortable, right, engaging in the conversation. So if you, regardless of how much the man knows and is talking and is in charge, spend more than 50% of your time looking at that woman who's just sitting there, if that's happening. And vice versa. If the woman is in charge, the man is just sitting there, then look at the man. But that will create, to your point, but it's eye contact. Simple as that. We take it for granted. We may not even notice what we're looking at, who we're looking at. Yeah.
After the financial crisis back in 2008, did you notice any difference in the men versus the women, but maybe when they got back in the market, or their different attitudes or things like that?
Yeah, it was interesting. So anytime there's a financial crisis, including 2008, both men and women acted very similarly, where we didn't see women more nervous than men, because it was such a seismic occurrence that both, and I'm sure you saw this with clients, both sides got very, very concerned. Don't trust the markets, don't trust providers, right? All of this. I want cash, I feel comfort in cash. But if there's a disruption, let's say the flash crash, right, that's not nearly as monumental as the financial crisis, on average, it takes a woman longer to overcome the trust issues. Women take trust very seriously. Men do too. But if trust is broken, and it could come from the markets or it could come from a provider, there needs to be a lot more in the way of helping the woman to feel more comfortable, right? Which gets a little bit into some of the research around the risk, although we're going to talk about that in a minute. I don't want to derail the conversation. Depends on the magnitude of it.
Our society has sponsored recently the gender diversity and Alpha conference.
The conference,
up in
yes,
Boston.
very well attended.
Yeah, and know that there's been a lot of research recently on gender diversity and the performance of teams that are gender diverse. So I was wondering if you had any quantitative benefits and examples of firms that have had success with diversity.
Yes. So in the investment management industry, there is very little research that shows diverse teams perform better than non-diverse teams. And that's because only 7% of portfolio managers are women. There's not enough of a sample size. We tried to get a sample size. We worked with the CFA. We sampled the CFA members. Rebecca Fender, who runs a future finance program, she's a close friend of mine. We tried to do that. And because of the nature of it and how few women and few diversity and diverse teams, you can't actually quantify it, is the sad but true point. But what we do know is in many other fields, we were talking about this earlier, the medical field, the legal field, much greater levels of diversity. And you can quantify and evaluate what that does to overall success. And it is huge in terms of how much more successful. Another example, on the board level, where there is quantifiable research, women, if you have an organization and there are a greater amount of women on, not greater amount than men, but at least more than, say, one woman on the board, then those organizations outperform, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was on every dimension. It was outperform in terms of ROE, net operating profit margin, long-term organizational performance. It was like a whole series. And those organizations suffer much less from trust issues and reputational damage issues. The rogue is like less, present in those organizations. Yeah.
That of course, that may be true that helps, but it doesn't, the data doesn't support it necessarily because it just shows correlation, not causation. It may be that companies that are good at lots of things also tend to be good about putting women on the board. It has nothing to say about whether the woman actually caused any of that or not.
No, and this is the nature of it. I mean, in any research, you cannot, the holy grail is to get to causation, and you can't. If you have enough data points and parameters and you control for a lot of other factors, like, oh, it's Apple, and they were successful because of this, and they weren't successful. So you end up putting all the control factors in to be able to have the best possible guess as to what the correlation is and what some of the reasons behind it. But you're right. In any research, we just ran all these regressions for motivation, and now, of course, it's not causation. We can't ever say that. But it's a pattern of correlation. Organizations that have higher degree of women on boards, they outperform on every dimension than those that don't.
I think there was a study about investment committees. Investment committees about 10, 15 years ago that said that they looked at investment committees, and investment committees that had women on the committee tended to have less of a downside. There wasn't as much aggressive behavior. They didn't tend to be over-allocated to equities.
Yes.
And therefore, their results tended to be better.
It was one of the consultancies, wasn't it? That
Yeah, I thought it was Cambridge, but
Cambridge. Yeah, it was. I remember that study. It was one of the
because
consultancies.
to me, that's the.
They need to revisit
the investment
that.
committee, to me, it's got to be documented. And if we went through the data of the top 50 investment committees, and then you looked at investment committees by industry,
Yep.
you could potentially get some of that thing.
Yeah, and I remember reading that research, and then we need to call our friends, whoever is at Cambridge or whoever, to update it because it was a little bit outdated. In which case, to be confident in something, it needs. But it makes the same point, and that's why you're bringing it up. That there is some evidence. It's just nobody is holistic because there's no sample. You can't look holistically at the industry because there's just not enough diverse teams, at the moment. But I will say, when it comes to the science behind diversity and why diverse teams matter, it's about cognitive diversity. We, male versus female, we operate very differently when it comes to processing of information. And this is quite interesting, where both biologically and psychologically, males tend to be much quicker when it comes to making a decision. Women take forever and a day sometimes, including myself, but we're much slower when it comes to making a decision. And there's a reason behind this as it relates to information processing. Men tend to take into consideration only the information that is consistent with their incoming hypothesis. And they discard and do not take into consideration information that is contradictory to their incoming hypothesis. On average, right? There's lots of qualifiers here. Women, and so it's quick. So they have conviction, they're decisive, and it's quick. But that's because they're not taking all the information into consideration to begin with. Women are much slower, and that's because we will take in all of the available inputs, even if they contradict what we think, what our hypothesis is. We'll take all that into consideration, and then we'll go back and forth and assess, well, this is this and this. And so we're much slower to make decisions, but that's because of the nature of the way that we process information. We take all available inputs. Now, neither is right or wrong, right? Because you do need you need to have some decisive. You can't just take forever and a day to decide things. But you also need to have a well-rounded assessment of all the information inputs in order to make an effective decision. So you put the two together, and that's where the science helps. Causation, correlation, right? That there is real science in the way that we process information quite differently from one another, and you bring the two together, and it's a beautiful thing.
Do you have any research on the effect of nature versus nurture and gender differences? In other words, as the world changes, and maybe girls may be raised differently now. Do you think that some of these behavioral differences are like inherent in a person, or like more
Yes,
long-term
this is
lasting?
well trodden upon in terms of academia, and there's a very real nature component, and there's also a very real nurture component. So, and it's quite balanced. And I'll turn the attention to investment management in a minute, but it comes down to the nature part, and think about how centuries and centuries, cavemen times, right, hunting and gathering versus where we are now. We cannot underestimate the nature component to who we are as male and as female. And that's point number one. Point number two is that we also can't underestimate the nurture component, because what we found is that many of these myths that we have as it relates to women in our industry are inaccurate when you put them in the context of an investment management organization, whether it's a wealth manager or asset manager, asset owner. One example is risk appetite, where we saw almost zero difference in risk appetite, male versus female, if they both work in an organizational context, right? Whereas we saw great differences, male-female, if they are not working in our industry and if they're just the mom and pop individual investors, right? Women tend to be more risk averse, men tend to be more risk assuming. Put them in an organizational context and they have on par equal amounts, and it's risk assuming in our industry because that's what we do for a living, we assume risk. So it balances it out. So there is an important nurture component, as well.
I'm like the dedicated devil's advocate today.
Good.
I would assume that research where the people in industry were the same were because the women who were more conservative actually didn't make it to that level.
Self-selection.
That you had self-selection, so you ended up with a tie by the time you got there, but it wasn't at the beginning.
So devil's advocate, you're a devil's advocate. The counteract to that is that looking at some of the research that we did, actually in conjunction with the CFA Institute, looking at so ask a series of questions. Why, as a woman, did you enter this industry? And followed them over time to see if there was a self-selection, and maybe they opted, or why did you not, importantly, why did you not choose a career? So studying, university students and things like that. Why would you pursue a career in investment management, or why would you not? In financial services in general. And what we found is that even the women who were they were worried about the risk side and not knowing if they'd be able to want to compete or to take on risk and all of this, once they were brought into Goldman Sachs, they were all set with risk, and we can take risk, and we're indoctrinated, and we're drinking the Kool-Aid, and it's all about risk management and assuming risk because that's what we do. So we've seen evidence that there's some extent of self-selection that goes on, but then even those that may have an innate risk aversion, once you put them into an organizational setting, and research bears this out too, then they end up assuming the right thing is by the organization, whether it's risk assumption or what.
But the people you studied, I'm guessing, were not all the women at Goldman. It were the women at a certain level in Goldman. So even if the people going in were the same, my guess is, among men or women, the people who are more risk-taking tend to be the ones that get promoted. just because the standard deviation is higher, the winners get promoted, the losers go out. So by the end of the day, you have all risk-seeking people left.
Well, that's a different story. So who gets promoted versus not has nothing to do with their risk appetite. Whether they get promoted or not is whether they have a very strong mentor behind them. And it could be a man or a woman having a strong mentor behind him or her. That's the number one reason that people are promoted and taken through the ranks. It had very little, because we saw people, and we're just using Golden as an example, but throughout that, very little risk appetite, but were promoted because they had a mentor. So risk becomes largely irrelevant. Someone has to have your back.
Is it more a function, though, kind of getting back to the idea that our business is so driven by a common acceptance of a definition of risk as being volatility?
Yes.
As opposed to,
Back to
isn't
your
it because
point.
we're all drinking the same Kool-Aid of,
Yes.
Bar Rosenberg and factor models and
This is
blah.
a huge, as much as, we all adore modern portfolio theory, Markowitz, 1952, it's done us a huge disservice in the sense of we needed that to establish the baseline, but we're still stuck there, right? With the equations and the definitions and the Sharpe ratios. This is the epicenter of our industry, but we need to move beyond that, and we're stuck. And you're right that, women are wired with abstraction, and so we innately want to move beyond that, but men, on average, it's the numbers, the quantifiable, and that's what modern portfolio theory gave us. And it was great to establish a baseline of our industry, and that was the birth of our industry, of our whole industry. But we do need to move beyond that, and I would say taking into consideration all of the behavioral, side overlaid onto the quantified side.
Can you share some personal examples, maybe that you've experienced or seen in terms of teams failing to build a diverse? Any kind of.
Now you're going off of a script
Yeah.
here. Oh, okay. Oh gosh. Well, one anecdote. This is interesting, where I shared this one statement with Michael Trotsky, who's one of your board members on the CFA Institute, with Massachusetts pension system. And they are very big advocates in terms of diversity within MassPrim, and it's the treasurer of the state of Massachusetts and all of this. If you insert one clause into the job description, and that one clause is salary negotiable, it reduces the pay gap by up to 45%. And so when I mentioned this to Michael Trotsky, he is now implementing that, and it is making a meaningful difference. And it's because women don't assume that we can negotiate the salary. Men, as the starting point, will negotiate the salary automatically. But women sort of question, salary is what it is, and so I either take the job or don't take the job. and so it doesn't come as naturally for women. But if that clause is in there that says, this salary is negotiable, I actually should negotiate this. And so it's personally for me, it's been, pretty amazing to see, because that research, came from the gender folklore study, to see how that one stat is now trickling into PIMCO, same thing. PIMCO's doing the same thing into their organizations. In terms of me personally, I found that if I can I've chosen a female mentor and a male mentor as a balance, and people who I believe will bring me forward within State Street. Before I was with IBM, in the same situation there, and I found that I really benefited from having both sides of the spectrum to help, really guide me and promote me through my career. So, I've had a very good success with that formula, but I'm sure that there's many other ways.
Yeah, do you have some recommendations?
Here's another personal anecdote.
Okay. Go ahead.
This might come up in conversations where, in both companies that I've recently worked for, we're establishing, they're not calling quotas, but they're calling them targets, but it's like a quota. And so the men at the very senior levels are quite angry, and I don't use that word lightly, angry, to say that the woman is going to get the spot that I deserve. And she may get the spot not based on her own skill set and what she brings to the table, but it's because she's a woman. And I've heard this real emotion, time and time again, and that's valid. That is completely fair, because by the way, that's happening too. So the flip side to this is we have to be very careful to make sure that, yes, we need to evaluate a slate of women as we're making, decisions to hire people, but stating the obvious, but I think men feel tremendous pressure to hire a woman for the sake of hiring a woman as opposed to selecting the best candidate, especially if there's a target in the way. So I've seen that, personally, and I think it's a very destructive set of emotions that is just, I don't know how to fix it or handle it, but I know it's top of mind, for State Street, and it was top of mind for IBM too, as to how to handle that.
Well, I don't advocate that, and I completely understand the man's point of view there. It is because women have been in that role up until now. So there have been countless times, as I say, on the flip side of that, where a man has been hired because only men were considered.
That's a good point. And research shows that. And research shows that too. Yep.
If you're a fiduciary, like with a pension plan, it strikes me if you insert the words salary negotiable, you've driven up your costs and open yourself to a suit because you're unnecessarily paying money you would have otherwise had to.
Well, so this is
That's
what,
underpaid.
and you can ask Michael Trotsky and ask Prim how they handled this, but they basically had to get the backing by the state treasurer of the state of Massachusetts to make sure that they were not going to be sued by putting that clause in. So
Yeah, because it strikes me
but they did it.
because you're saying, please take more money.
Yeah.
Then we would have to pay you otherwise.
It's
I
negotiable
know,
with their
but
range.
if the women are
Exactly.
negotiating,
There's a
if
cap.
it's reducing
It's not
pay,
like unlimited.
pay disparity, it implies that women are getting more money than you would have otherwise had to pay them.
No, it's fair.
You are the devil's advocate.
Or maybe just the devil, either way.
It would seem like one of the best places to test out or kind of reinforce some of the observations that you've made about investment management would be in the military.
Yeah.
Because are the same types of discussions going on in that area as well?
I do not know enough about military to even comment there, but I see the parallel that you're drawing, and it's one of the, and part of it is the nature of the military, but it would be a very interesting case study to explore. Maybe we're going to be off this motivation paper that we're releasing imminently. We're going to be doing another gender cut, probably in conjunction with the CFA Institute, but it would be interesting to look at that as a case study to see what we could learn. That's on my to-do list now.
If we're to move from less than 10% female portfolio managers to something more broadly representative of general society, you have some recommendations as to how best to do that. And also for us, specifically for our society, we're very interested in recruiting more women to the industry. I think maybe your talent pool is also still not representative of broader society. How can we close this and avoid this issue that you just mentioned where, oh gosh, they just hired a woman just to cover.
Exactly. And again, I'm not going to promise to have all the answers here, but what we've seen, a couple things that organizations have done very successfully in our industry as well as other industries. And one is to make sure you at least have an even slate of male-female candidates if you're looking to recruit someone. So if you have 5 men, you should have 5 women, and force yourself to have 5 women. So at least you're starting with an even slate, in which case you can evaluate based on that. Because we're human, we actually like to be with people that are like us. We talked about this. And there's nothing wrong with that, apart from we end up making bad decisions as a result. Because, I'm a woman, I like to be with women, and which leads to the second point, which is that as you're going through that process, and even in your ongoing day-to-day, whether it's with your clients or whether it's within your organizations, to really become much more aware and sensitive to your own biases that exist. And much of this is unconscious. You may not realize that you like to be, if you're a man, you like to be with a man more than you like to be with a woman. Like that's not in the conscious domain. It's just you clicked with the person. You had a gut feel about this person. And so there's a lot of examples. We've gone through, has anyone done unconscious bias training? Yeah. No? It's really cool. And it's, so I don't know who the organization was that came in and did all of our, but I'm like, I research behavioral biases for a living. I don't suffer from any of those. They caught me every time. And so it's true for women too. We have behavioral biases too in terms of like selecting men. So become much more aware of your unconscious, biases that you might have. And then, finally is what I said earlier, but organizations that can prioritize mentorship, they have a better time at having women in leadership positions and women in portfolio management positions if the organization itself prioritizes mentorship. It's a very powerful tool that I see some organizations are big believers and others it's more of a hobby. People kind of have to do it on their own. State Street has a big system infrastructure in place. And then I'd say last thing is we're seeing a lot of successful organizations create an opening for a woman if she wants to go raise a family for a period of 5 years or 10 years to say, we will commit to bringing you back in our organization in a predetermined amount of time. Not necessarily the role we can promise you or the title, but we will commit to you to bring you back in this organization. You do this for high performing talent, obviously, that you really want to keep. And that has made a measurable increase in terms of the difference of women who may not normally have thought that they could even go back after raising children to say, I could go back, and it plants the seed. And then more often than not, we've seen that they do go back because it showed that that company was so committed to them and they felt so loyal to the organization that they chose to go back to work, after having raised children. So some, back to your point earlier, some, these aren't easy things to do by any means, but they are things that we can all be doing, starting on, say, Monday morning to be able to start to move the needle here.
All right. We are a little bit over time, but I'll take maybe just one more. Merlin, go ahead.
So as an industry, we're predominantly narrowly focused on winning in the short term.
Yep.
So given that general characteristic, that's why we don't see any women coming into the business in the first place. So everything you just said, we're in an open position to consider 5 men and 5 women. There are women there to begin with to consider. So
There's a pipeline problem, which gets back to your point earlier around how can we start to evolve our industry to move away from that short-term outperformance. Think about the word alpha. Right? That you can't get more male than that word, and not that we're going to we need alpha. We can't overhaul, but the language that we use, the emphasis that we have, it does. You're absolutely right. It starts there, and that's what this folklore of finance is all about. Is we do believe the models for success are fundamentally broken, and we need to create a better way forward.